Morning everyone, good to see you, or more to speak to you. I hope that you're coping well as we enter into the 5th week of lockdown. Eileen has read to us earlier the story of the Emmaus road, which I'm sure you know very well. Let me summarise our passage from Luke's version. There's a meeting. There's a meeting between Jesus with two friends who don't recognise him. How can that be? There's a meal, and there's a fleeting moment when their eyes were opened and they recognise the Messiah before he mysteriously disappears. They reflect that the scriptures were opened to them, their hearts were opened, and they still don't fully grasp the good news. That is until we read a little bit later that their minds were opened and they embraced the enormity of the whole story. We're going to reflect on that story as we gather around the Lord's table. 3 times Luke speaks of opening. He speaks of, in verse 31, of their eyes being opened, and then he disappeared. In verse 32, the scriptures were opened to them and they heard, but they clearly didn't understand. And if you read a little further in verse 45, Jesus opened their minds, and it's then that they grasp the fullness of the gospel. A famous theologian called N.T. Wright considers the detailed narration of the Emmaus journey in Luke as one of the best sketches of a biblical scene. Another writer, Mosner, writes, the Emmaus story is one of Luke's most exquisite literary achievements. It describes the encounter on the road to Emmaus and the supper at Emmaus. It states that a disciple named Cleopas was walking towards Emmaus with another disciple when they met Jesus. They did not recognize him, and they discussed their sadness at recent events with him. They persuaded him to come and eat with them, and at the meal they recognized him. Mark records the incident, but typically of Mark, in his haste perhaps, he misses the point of the whole event. In chapter 16 he says, afterward Jesus appeared in a different form to 2 of them while they were walking in the country. These returned and reported to the rest, but they still did not believe them either. This is not so much a story of mistaken identity, but rather of how one discerns the mind of Christ. How did you get on with my riddle? A father and son have a car accident and they were both badly hurt. They are both taken to separate hospitals. When the boy is taken in for an operation, the surgeon says, I cannot do the surgery because this is my son. How is this possible? Did you realise that it was probably his mother? A few years ago, that would have stumped most people. Probably most people get the idea now. In the narrative, the disciples inexplicably mistake Jesus as a stranger. How could that happen? We would recognise Jesus for sure. Or would we? If coronavirus has taught us anything, it is that our assumptions are just that. They are just assumptions. We are at a crucial juncture as a society. Many people cannot wait for us to get back to normal. But I feel that we as followers of Jesus are called to discern what Jesus is saying to us in the middle of what is, after all, not so unusual in historic terms. Pandemics come and pandemics go. We recognise how fragile our society is, and we must be a prophetic people in the new normal. Do you hope that we'll see things differently? I do. But the example of our story of the road to Emmaus is threefold for opening. Open our eyes, open our understanding, and open our minds. That we can be open to what God is saying in a meaningful way. Help us, Lord, to be closer to you as we make our way through this journey. The disciples on the road met Jesus in the light of the resurrection, but still sad, sorrowful, shattered, stricken, surprised, stunned, scared and sceptical. We are all on the road to Emmaus. The question is, how do we deal with such experiences and feelings? How do we cope with the dramatic events that leave us traumatized? How do we arrest the silent but deadly hemorrhage of our faith? How do we cope with the world? How do we cope with ourselves? The Lord opened the eyes, hearts and minds of the disciples, but they cooperated. It wasn't forced upon them. We too can either cooperate or resist. The Lord calls us to open our eyes, hearts and minds. Do you want to cooperate?